All right, for the first one, we're writing the opposite of negative 19. The opposite of negative 19 is going to be positive 19. Next, we are finding absolute value. So the first one says, what's the absolute value of 3 and 5/10? That is going to be positive 3 and 5/10. And then the next one, we're doing the opposite of the absolute value of negative 23. So if we look, let's start inside of our absolute value. The absolute value of negative 23 is 23, but then we have to take the opposite of that, which makes this negative 23. The next one says, write the value of the given number, which is the opposite of negative 10. So similar to the one we just did, we're going to look at negative 10. We're going to take the opposite, which is positive 10, and then we take the opposite again, which is back to negative 10. And then finally, the last one says the opposite of 89. So start at 89 and work backwards. 89, what's the opposite of that? It's going to be negative 89, and then the opposite of that is negative 89. All right, guys, so the temperature outside Miss Sherrick's house was negative 5 degrees Fahrenheit and negative 7 degrees Fahrenheit at Miss Townsend's house. Which was the temperature cooler at? The answer would be Miss Townsend's house. And then the next one, we are filling in the missing integers on the number line, and then we're going to graph the temperatures from the problem above. So I'm going to go ahead and fill the numbers in, and then we'll graph them together. Okay, so first let's graph negative 5, which is here, and then the next one is negative 7, which is here. All right, guys, so for this next one, we're changing each of these fractions to decimals. So for this first one, we've got 1 1/5. I already know my whole number is going to be 1. And then all I need to do here is divide my 1/5. So top dog in the house, we're going to put our 1 inside the house and our 5 outside. I had to scoot that down a bit. Okay, so 5 cannot go into 1, so we add a decimal and add a 0. But 5 can go into 10. 2 times 5 is 10. And we are done. So our number would be 1.2, or 1 2/10 would be that fraction as a decimal. For the next one, we're going to do the same thing. There is no whole number, so we don't have to put our whole number, but it is negative. So I'm going to go ahead and write my negative, and then I'm going to divide, again, top dog in the house. 2 in the house, 9 outside. 9 cannot go into 2, but it can go into 20 2 times. 2 times 9 is 18. When I subtract, I get 2. Add a 0, drop a 0. Ooh, I have 20 again. 9 can go into 22 times. As you can see here, the pattern's going to keep going. I'm going to keep getting 2. So this is going to be repeating. So 0 and 22 hundredths, and I'll put my little repeating sign above it. All right, for this next one, we are ordering these numbers from least to greatest. And while they're all negative, we've got fractions, we've got decimals, we've got absolute value signs, we've got a lot of things going on here, so we need to simplify. So let's start with our first number, which is negative 1 2/5. We need to convert that to a decimal. So we know it's going to be negative 1 point something. We have to divide 2/5. So top dog in the house, our 2 goes in the house, our 5 is outside. 5 cannot go into 2, right? So we're going to add a decimal and add a 0. But 5 can go into 20 4 times. 4 times 5 is 20. And we're done. So it's going to be 1.4, negative 1.4 for our first number there. Our second number is actually, we don't have to simplify. So we're just going to keep it as 1.2. But our final number, we are going to have to simplify. If I'm just looking to figure out if it's negative or positive, let's do that first. So if you look, we've got 1 4/9. What's the absolute value of 1 4/9? Well, that's going to be 1 4/9. But then we have to take the opposite of that. So our answer is going to be negative. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that negative down. And it's going to be 1 point something. So we need to divide 9 into 4 to figure out what that is. So 9 cannot go into 4, but it can go into 40 4 times. 4 times 9 is 36. When we subtract, we get 4. Add a 0, drop a 0. Oh, we have 40 again. So we're going to notice here that it's going to repeat as well. We're going to keep getting a 4. So we can go ahead and stop there. And this next one is going to be negative 1 4/10 with the 4 repeating. So right now these numbers are actually difficult to compare because we've got 2 that look very similar. So what I'm going to do is add my next digit to each of these numbers so I can compare them nicely. So for my first one, if I added another digit, it's going to have to be a 0. For my second one, if I add a digit, it's also going to have to be 0. For my last one, if I add a digit, since it's repeating, it's going to have to be a 4. So that helps us compare a little bit better. Okay, so I'm looking at these answers here. I need to figure out which one is my smallest and which one is my greatest. So since they're all negative, the one that looks bigger actually has a smaller value. So the one that actually looks the biggest is going to be this guy down here, the last one that we did. 1 and 44 hundredths is going to be our smallest number. Our next smallest number is going to be the guy up top. And then our largest number is actually the one in the middle. So when I go to rewrite it, remember we have to use the original format that they gave us. So our smallest one is going to be negative absolute value of 1 and 4/9, comma. Our next one is going to be the first number that was written, which was negative 1 and 2/5. And then the largest one is going to be negative 1 and 2/10. All right, same thing here. We're ordering from least to greatest. We do have all decimals here, which is nice, but we have some absolute value and opposite signs that we need to take care of first. So let's take a look at our first number. We don't actually have to do anything with that. We're just going to keep it 0 and 76 thousandths. It is negative. Our next one over, okay, if we take a look, the absolute value of 0.76 is going to be 0.76, but then we have to take the opposite. So our final answer for this one is going to be negative 0.76. Our next one over, we don't have to do anything with that one, and it's positive. So we're just going to bring that down. And then our very last one, it's saying what's the opposite of negative 0.766. So negative 0.766, the opposite would be positive 0.766. So 0.766. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is make sure we have the same amount of digits behind every number. So we need 3 digits. The only one that I need to add something to is this one, and it's going to be a 0. All right, so when we start to compare, we're doing from smallest to greatest. So our negatives are going to be our smallest of all of them. So let's just focus on our 2 top negative numbers that we have here. And if we look at those, remember the one that appears to be larger actually has a smaller value. So this one right here is going to be our smallest, and then our next smallest would be this one. And then if we look at our 2 positive numbers, those should be a little bit easier. This is going to be our next biggest number, and then finally our biggest number is right here. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and rewrite it, but make sure that we write it in the original format. So our smallest number was written as negative absolute value of 0.76, comma. Our next one was written, we didn't have to do anything to that one. It was the first number, 0.076. Okay, our next one that we were going to write was also not changed, 0.706. And then finally, our final one that we have to write actually was, we did have to fix. It was the opposite of negative 0.766. And that's it. All right, the next one, it's asking us to represent 15 degrees below 0 as an integer. So integers, remember, can be negative or positive. So if we're saying below 0, it is going to be negative 15 would be how we would write that integer. The next one says the Volunteers had a gain of 10 yards and the Bulldogs had a loss of 20 yards. Which team had the greatest change in yardage? So if we're talking about change in yardage, overall change, we're going to think about the absolute value of those numbers. So 10, right, the absolute value of 10 is 10. A loss of 20 would be negative 20, but we're going to look at the absolute value, which would be just 20. Okay, so if we're comparing those two numbers, that should be a 10. If we're comparing those two numbers, then you can see very clearly that the Bulldogs had a greater change of yardage. All right, and then finally, Miss May and her husband went scuba diving in the Bahamas on spring break. She dove down 20 feet, and Mr. May is below her. Which integer could be Mr. May's elevation? So if you think about a body of water, okay, Miss May dove down, and her elevation, she's right here. Her elevation, they said, was 20 feet. So I'm just going to write 20. And then it says Mr. May is below her, so that means even deeper down. So the only option that would work would be negative 22 feet. All right, for this one, we're graphing the integers on the number line below. So the first one is 2 1/10. So that would be between 2 and 3, but closer to 2. So maybe like about right here would be our 2 1/10. The next one is negative 1 1/10. So that's going to be between negative 1 and negative 2. So maybe around here. Doesn't have to be exact. Negative 1 1/10. That's this one. Our next one is negative 8/10. So that's going to be between 0 and negative 1, but closer to negative 1. So about here, negative 0.8. And then finally, our last one is going to be negative 2 4/10. That's going to be between negative 2 and negative 3, kind of in the middle there. So negative 2 4/10. All right, the next one says the table shows the change in weights of 3 people. Which person lost the most weight? So if you're looking at the greatest loss of weight, that very clearly is going to be Derek, right? He had negative 3 25/100ths. That's how much weight he lost. So Derek is going to be the answer. And then write an inequality statement comparing the change in weight between Hank and Sarah. So if we're doing change in weight, the amount of change, we're going to do absolute value. All right, so if we look at it, Hank had a change of 3 2/10. So we're going to take the absolute value of that. And we're comparing it to Sarah, who had negative 3 21/100ths. So if we're comparing those two, we got to figure out what symbol to use. The absolute value of 3 2/10 is just 3 2/10. And the absolute value of negative 3 21/100ths would be 3 21 positive. So it's going to be positive. And to make sure that we're comparing them correctly, we want to make sure we add a 0 at the end, so we've got the same amount of digits behind the decimal place. And we can see pretty clearly here that Sarah is actually the one who had the greatest change in weight. So this would be the inequality statement that you would write to represent this scenario. All right, this next one here, we are comparing different numbers together. So let's take a look at our first one here. We've got the absolute value of negative 2. Well, the absolute value of negative 2 is 2. And we're comparing it to 2 3/5. So we know it's going to be 2 point something. So let's quickly figure out what that something is. We need to divide 5 into 3. 5 into 3. 5 cannot go into 3, but it can go into 30 6 times, and that would be 30. And we're done. So it's going to be 2.6 here. So we're comparing 2 and 2.6, which we know 2.6 is actually going to be larger. So we're going to be using the less than sign here. And then for the next one, let's first handle the absolute value sign and simplify the number a little bit. So if we've got the absolute value of negative 1/9 is going to be positive 1/9. But then we have to take the opposite of that, which is going to be negative 1/9. So we've got negative something. We need to figure out what it is as a decimal. So we're going to see how many times 9 can go into 1. Well, 9 can't go into 1, but it can go into 10 one time. Subtract, we get 1. Add a 0, drop a 0. You will see here again it starts repeating because you're going to keep wanting to multiply 9 by 1. So we're going to go ahead and stop there, and this is going to be negative 0 1/10 repeating. And then if we look on the other side, we actually don't have to do anything with this number, so we're just comparing that to 0 1/10. Well, right now they look identical, but remember we have to be careful here with repeating decimals. If I were to add a digit to the one on the left, I would have to add another 1, and if I were to add a digit to the one on the right, I would have to add a 0. So the two numbers are actually different. And when we look here, 0 1/10, negative 0 1/10 is actually larger than negative 0 11/10 repeating, so we are going to also use the less than sign here.